All right, good. Well, I hope to definitely make some room for discussion, for questions and answers. I want to do this really informally. I have a presentation. There's a number of hidden slides at the end because, as you can probably guess, with soil health assessment, we could dive in depth on any one of the ways to assess. There's a lot of questions that could be answered. You know, this is again one of those things that we could do a half-day course on, and you would know a lot more than you will with this session. But I'll just kind of give you some highlights on soil health assessment. I want to start this up by saying, you know, one of the things that launched us into developing laboratory assessments was that when I was working at a university, you know, universities, the land grant universities provide nutrient recommendations, right? So farmer sends in a soil sample, it gets tested for nutrient availability, and it comes back with, you know, your phosphorus is too high, your potassium is too low, your pH is too low, and here's what you do about it, right? You apply this fertilizer, you apply this lime, you stop applying phosphorus, whatever it may be, right? You have to reduce your manure inputs. And that's what farmers by and large still know as soil health testing. But that doesn't get us everywhere. And here's a key example. This slide right here, these two soils are both Buxton silt loam, which is a soil type in New Hampshire. And this farm used to grow strawberries, right, on the right here. Used to grow strawberries, couldn't grow them anymore. They were getting way too many pathogens. They just weren't working out. Everything before the fruit would even get ripe, they would just lose most of it. They tried growing sweet corn for a while. It really wasn't working. This was conventionally tilled, never cover cropped, no inputs other than fertilizers and pesticides and those kinds of things. And it got rutted, soil health declined. It was looking awful. Yet taking a soil test, a standard soil test, said this one was better because all the nutrients, the pH had been managed just fine, right? And yet it wasn't functioning. This soil on the left here is an organic mixed farm with livestock in rotation, with vegetables, with grains. They've got a little bit of everything. And this is what their soil looks like. And it's the same soil type, right? This is the impact of management. And it really kind of, there were stories like this all over the Northeast when I first started getting into sort of soil health from the research angle. And we really started to see, well, we're not looking at the right things. We're looking at some of the right things. You know, it's kind of like if you went to the doctor and you had a broken leg and then never thought to ask you about your broken leg, right? If you're missing the really key thing that's the constraint that's driving things not functioning, then what do you do about it, right? So you have to identify the constraints. So I think the key thing about soil health assessment that I want you all to remember from this is we need to look at all the different parts of how the soil functions in order to be able to bring it back to a well-functioning, sustainable system. To regenerate that soil, we have to actually identify what the issues are. And most of our soils are somewhere down here on the spiral, right? Most of our soils, by and large these days, are fairly degraded because we've been doing the kinds of things that degrade soil other than in those niche markets. You know, the organic growers have had a lot of stuff figured out for a while, right? They're actually managing for biota. They just do a lot of tillage and that's damaging. And some deal with that better than others. You know, there's a couple other sort of niche systems where farmers have been really in tune with the biology of what's going on in their soils and taking care of that. But most of our acreage is very degraded. And so we need to not just look at what nutrients and pH constraints are, but we need to look at the biological and physical constraints when we assess soil health, right? So when you get into soil health assessment, there's a huge list, and these are probably not even all of them. There's a huge list of why you might want to do a soil health assessment. And this is probably more where you all will be involved than in actually doing, say, a laboratory assessment and guiding a producer in that, although some of you are planners, so you might actually be developing that conservation plan to get them on the right track. I would say these first two are the key things in terms of changing things, in terms of turning things around on one farm, right? To understand what the constraints are, or if you're working with NRCS, NRCS talks about resource concerns. You will hear about the conservation planning process and how resource concerns are sort of that first initial thing. You identify the resource concerns, you identify the problems. So if you don't know what your problem is, you can't fix it, right? You got to know what your problem is so that then you can fix that problem, right? You can target your management practices to alleviate those constraints. If you have a cold and somebody puts a cast on your leg, that's not going to help you, right? If you have a very poor diet and somebody gives you ibuprofen, maybe it'll make you feel better for the day, but probably feeling poor is because of something else, right? If you're not getting enough exercise and you're not feeling great, it's not going to do any good to give you, whatever, malaria medicine, right? So we can tie these human health analogies to this to help somebody who doesn't know anything about soil understand why this matters. For soil health assessment, we want to know what the problem is, what about the soil isn't functioning. And if we understand a little bit about how soil processes work, how the soil works, what kinds of things we want it to do, and how taking care of protecting the habitat of those underground livestock and feeding them, how that builds the soil back up into that nice, sound, solid house that can do all the various things it needs to do. When we understand a little bit about that and a bit about how the management practices influence that, then we can assess soil health, figure out what's wrong with it, and target our management practices. For example, if you have a compacted layer at 8 inches from decades of moldboard plowing, that compacted layer can be taken out of the soil, can be rebuilt into nice soft soil in a variety of ways. But if you're growing a cover crop that's really just at the surface, that's got very shallow fibrous roots that doesn't get through that pan, that's not going to do you as well as if you pick a cover crop that specifically has deep tap roots that go through that compacted pan to allow the water to flow back through it again and to allow other roots to follow those tap roots. So those are the kinds of things we're talking about here. Now, there are other reasons for soil health assessment, like being able to measure soil improvement or degradation from management over time. So you might get your baseline, here's what it's like right now, change management, and 3 to 5 years later, 10 years later, keep doing the same assessments and measure, am I actually improving? Is this working or is it not working? Do I need to adjust my management to make it, to further improve my soils? Applied research. For a long time, we've had all these different soil health assessment measures be used by different labs, but they're not the same between different labs. It's often hard to compare, but yeah, you can take a particular study, a particular trial on a research farm or on a commercial farm, and you can at least compare, with this management versus that management, is one better than the other by using indicators. The more we have some standards, the more we can compare across the country and have everybody learn together. Improving awareness of soil health. It was amazing when I went to farmers with a soil health report and said, hey, look at this. You knew that you were managing your pH. You knew you were managing your phosphorus. You've done a great job. These all show up as just fine. But gosh, look at this. Your aggregate stability is low. You have a compacted subsoil and your biological activity is really low, right? Now you open the producer's eyes to the specific things that they've never thought to look at that are actually issues that need to be worked on. So really kind of understanding why soil health is important can be facilitated by having some of these soil health assessments. Some other things that are being worked on, things like farmland valuation. Right now it's mostly about where the farm is, what kinds of crops it can grow, but there's a lot of interest out there in using soil health assessments to say, hey, this land has been really well taken care of. It should sell for more money. And I think that's starting to happen. People are starting to be able to sell farmland and say, look, this farmland has been in no-till for 40 years. It's been cover crop for 30 years. It's in really good shape. I'm going to ask more money for it. Assessing farming system risk, right? If we know that we have a really degraded soil, like say a producer is thinking about buying some land and they see all the signs of poor soil health, if they know anything about it, they're going to be able to look at that and say, wow, I'm going to have a lot of risk as I start managing these soils because they're in really poor shape. And then finally, enabling policy recommendations, right, that are science-based, where we can really say, okay, these management practices work. These management practices are degrading our soils. Here's where we need to go, and here's how we can use assessments. A lot of good reasons to use assessments. I'm going to do two things. I'm going to first, hold on, right, okay. So there's assessments, and then NRCS, when we look at soil health resource concerns, I just want to define that for you, because I think a lot of you will at some point in their interface with NRCS, and if you have a little bit of understanding of the lingo, that's helpful. A resource concern is a different way of stating there is a problem on the land that needs to be fixed, right? And there are resource concerns for soil, water, animals, plants, humans. NRCS has, I think right now, 42 resource concerns that each planner specifically looks for. The definition of a resource concern is either an existing or an expected degradation of the soil, water, air, plant, or animal resource base to the extent that the sustainability or intended use of the resource is impaired. Okay, so how do we want to use this resource? And is it either degraded right now, or do we expect that current management is going to degrade it? If either of those is a yes, then we need to change management. And that's how NRCS goes about conservation planning. So there are 4 explicitly soil health resource concerns. 2 of them we added while I was with NRCS, and so we updated compaction and organic matter depletion. Those had been there for a long time, but we added soil organism habitat or degradation and aggregate instability, because they're such key root cause kind of resource concerns that actually are at the foundation of a large number of the other resource concerns that NRCS looks at. So having kind of looked at, okay, what's the problem? How do we define it? Now let's go a bit into the actual assessment. And then I want to leave a bit of time for question and answer. There's basically two general approaches we can take, right? We can do an infield assessment. So looking at indicators that are an assessment of a soil property that provides information about specific soil processes to tell us something about how the soil functions, right? We can do that infield. And I think, my guess is most of you that are with us today, that's where you're going to spend most of your time is doing any kind of assessment in the field, because you might walk the land with a producer, and therefore you'll see their fields. And if you can pick up on some of these indicators that are very easy to just visually say, wow, you've got a problem, or everything looks in good shape, that'll be really beneficial in terms of a conversation about soil health. Infield assessments tend to be more qualitative rather than quantitative. We can make some of them semi-quantitative. There's a little less ability to control them, to put a number on them. They tend to be a little, they tend to be not as good for monitoring type purposes, right? You have to make a lot of change so that you look at the same field again and can be confident that that's actually changed when you're looking at these very qualitative indicators. But then they tend to be more visual and very quickly assessed. And so they can lead to an instant conversation on soil health. Laboratory assessments, on the other hand, tend to be very quantitative measures. There's a lot you can control. You can control the sampling process. You can control how the sample is treated once it gets to the lab. You can control exactly what method you put it through, the number that comes out at the end, how you interpret that number with certain algorithms. And so it tends to be better sort of for really quantitatively looking at where things are at, monitoring over time. They're good for that longer term conversation where you say, okay, well, let's get our baseline of where these numbers are at, and then take a look at it again, 3 years later, where are we at, right? You take the sample, you come back a month later with the results and have a discussion about what all that means and what it might mean for management. Laboratory assessments haven't been available in the past, and we're just getting to the point where they're really becoming more available. Just last year, finally, after a number of years of working on this, and after the Farm Bill had in it soil testing as a conservation practice, it was basically mandated that we actually do what we had been trying to do for many, many years. So woohoo, great sign for policy being able to make an impact, great sign for work like what we do at AFT influencing what the Farm Bill says. It really makes a big impact, right? We now have some standard methods for laboratory assessment that NRCS provides financial and technical assistance for, and you'll hear a bit more on that from some of the folks in states. We actually got that implemented, so that's really exciting. So now there's a lot of labs ramping up to be able to offer these methods. They're still a bit in flux. There's still going to be changes, but it is now possible to send off a sample and get some kind of soil health assessment throughout most of the country, and there are some interpretations available in most of the country. So that's good progress. Okay, but infield assessment is mostly where you all are going to be at. And so I want to spend a short bit of time on that. Components of an infield assessment, a field visit is really important. Can't assess in the field if you're not actually seeing the field. And really ideally doing that with the producer or the landowner so that you can have that conversation about what the management is, what they observe. Do you see ponding after a rain? How long does it last? Do your crops tend to get droughty in August when you don't see rain for a week or two? You can ask these kinds of questions and get a feel for it. And it's a good idea to get on the NRCS web soil survey to download the soil type so that you have a bit of an understanding of the inherent soil that farmer has. Some soils are inherently really easy to deal with. Some soils inherently are a little more tricky. So it's a good idea to have that background information. And then there's some things that you might want to bring to the field with you. Depending on how far in depth you go, if you're a conservation planner, you might want to bring all of these things. If you're an easement person that only does this once or twice a year, bring your ability to have that conversation, have a couple of questions in your back pocket. Take along the worksheet for the technical note that I'll show you in a moment with some of those questions. Have your soil survey information, bring a shovel, maybe bring a soil knife, bring some water and a couple of cups, bring some sink strainers if you have them to be able to do that aggregate stability demo. Camera's always good to have, right? Bring some of these tools so that you can help the producer understand if they've got some issues. I'm just going to briefly say, web soil survey will tell you your inherent soil type, your inherent properties, what that parent material is. Is it on bedrock that's shallow, or do you have a really deep soil? Is it a very dense clayey soil that's likely to stay wet for a long time? Do you have a sandy soil that's likely to get droughty? Those kinds of things. But management is the primary driver of whether there's a resource concern, whether there's a management-related problem that can be fixed with management. And so the site-specific information is really important. Soil survey, even though they have some soil health interpretations in there right now, those interpretations are more about vulnerability. How likely is that soil to have certain kinds of issues? And there's some debate about, how those can best be used. And so I just want you to be aware of that. The Cropland Infield Soil Health Assessment, we put together a technical note at NRCS on that when I was there. And so you can find a lot of really in-depth guidance. And so if you're going to do any of this in more than just, walk out in the field and pick up on a few visual cues, you might want to download that document. It has in it a management history survey that gives you some of the kinds of questions you might want to ask a producer to understand better where they're at in terms of managing for healthy soils. It also has in it a worksheet. I know this is small and you can't read it all. What I'm going to say about it is when you see that worksheet, there's information about what time of year or in what kind of system you might want to do different ones of these indicators, because some of them work really well right after a rain. Some of them do not. Some of them are really only for no-till systems, and some of them can be used in any system. And this gives you information about that. The key is there's 11 indicators here you might look at, and all of them are designed to be kind of a quick visual assessment. Stick a shovel in the ground or even just kind of look across the field. So it's nice because it's a quick ability to gauge where that field is at. And there's a worksheet there on whether there's a resource concern or not. Each state is kind of tweaking these. And the technical note is linked right here. So you can get a lot more information about that if you're interested. I'm going to just go over a few of these indicators. I'm not going to go through all 11 because we don't have time for that. I might even skip over some of the slides I have here because I want to give you a chance to ask questions. But one thing I'll say is the first couple of indicators here are the kind of indicator where you just kind of look across the field and see whether it's there or not. The other indicators are the ones where you might want to stick a shovel in the field in one spot, in 2 or 3 spots, in a fence row versus a spot in the field to be able to assess those. So just a couple that you can look at. Soil cover, right? So there's a table in each of this. We use this in the 3-day course for conservation planners that NRCS had put together. And so there's a lot more in-depth information than you might need right now. But basically each of these tables that you'll have when I get you these slides has a description of what that indicator is, what resource concerns are related to that indicator, what some of the infield assessments are, and then sort of for national purposes, a first cut at what criteria would be. So having soil cover be more than 75% after planting is pretty ideal. Now, you can't always get out there right after planting, and so that might mean you'll have a conversation with the producer to assess that. But being able to go out there and see, you know, is there a lot of cover left after it got planted or not? And states might adjust these, right? So, you know, here's an example of, here's some, you know, some corn stubble, and here's some corn stubble with a cover crop growing in it. So this side right here would meet that resource concern, whereas this side would not. A system like this right here, that would meet that resource concern because more than 75% of that soil is covered. Surface crusts. We've talked a fair bit about aggregate stability. Surface crusts are one sign that you can see in the field. When you walk out there, if you see crusting like this in more than 5% of the field, or whatever a specific state might say is the appropriate threshold for that soil type or in their state, if you see this kind of crusting, you know there's a soil health problem. And it can look various ways, right? You can stick a shovel in the ground and actually get crusts like this that are solid to come up. Or you can look across the field and you might see that there's signs of where water ran and transported a lot of soil particles. You can see cracking like this across a field. Ponding, you know, this, you don't always get out there right after a really intense rainfall, but if you get out there after a really intense rainfall, you know, half a day later, certainly a day later, these criteria are set up to say, basically, if you have evidence of ponding 24 hours or less after a typical rainfall event, you're probably okay. But if it's still there, if you can still really see that a whole day later, that's too much. That's going to really start stressing plants. It means that your soil is not infiltrating. Now, a key thing to understand about ponding is that it's not just an issue right there in the spotted ponds. The reason you often get ponding is if you have low aggregate stability, because if you have low aggregate stability in all these higher areas, the water's not going in right where it hits. And so that means it's going to run off, it's going to pool together in the lower spots, and it's going to cause that kind of ponding. And it's going to have a really hard time infiltrating even there, but eventually it will. Maybe the water will sit there for a week, right? We have these kinds of systems. And we then get issues like right here, this corn didn't get the nitrogen it needed because the nitrogen turned into either nitrous oxide or it leached out as nitrate, and there you go, you didn't have that nitrogen left anymore. So now the producer takes an economic hit because they lost all that nitrogen they paid for, and they don't get that crop, right? Penetration resistance, a way to measure compaction. There are various ways to get at compaction. One of them is using a penetrometer. So there's a link here if you're interested. This is a really good tool to have in your toolbox. And this is a nice little 5-minute video from University of Wisconsin that shows somebody using it with a little conversation about it. So that's one good way to look at it. But also you can look at roots and at platy structure to see whether you've got compaction. If you see roots doing this, it means you've got a problem, right? Your roots should not be taking J turns or you know, crooked, you know, going along a plated structure until they finally find a hole. If you see something like this versus that, right? These are fibrous roots with nice crumbly soil texture, everything, soil structure, everything's good here. And here you've got one little root in this big clod. That root is not able to access water or nutrients nearly as well as these roots right here. So those are the kinds of issues you can look for just in a shovel full of soil. Beth, remind me what time this session ends, 10:30?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm just going to quickly go through the rest, right? Aggregate stability, we spent a lot of time talking about it. We want those nice chocolate cake crumbly aggregates. That's often how I've heard folks talk about it, right? If you have nice chocolate crumbs, that's a good sign. You want this, right? You want that infiltration. You don't want this runoff. And we looked at a bunch of these tests. right? We looked at the slump test, we looked at the slake test, and here's a clear sign of lack of aggregate stability in this field, right? This is not what we want to see. Plant roots and biopores. You can look, if you stick a shovel in the ground, you can see has a root followed an old root channel where there's organic matter deposited. So there's various things you can do. There's also an app for that. Colleagues at ARS put together Land PKS, or Land Potential Knowledge System. It's basically a free cloud system where you can share your data on your land. A lot of range folks are using it, but a lot of others are using it too. And it basically now has a soil health module. There's nice videos about how to do these assessments. So if you're wanting to actually see someone do them in the field, he does them in New Mexico. So the system's a little different, but I think they're still very useful videos. Okay, laboratory tests. I'll say a few brief things. We've talked about how we want to get past nutrient testing. We want to test all of soil health. And so, we were at, that old wooden wheel. Now we might be about here, right? We've upgraded our ability to test these in a laboratory. We're not here yet. We're not at the fancy wheel that's exactly the right thing yet. But I think that we've got a lot more access to soil health assessment now than we did even 10 years ago. So that's really exciting. Technical note 45003 gives a lot of good detail on the sort of current best available, now a couple of years old. It's going to get updated again, but current best available laboratory methods if you're interested in that. And now the NRCS Soil Testing Conservation Activity 216 is the way to test for soil health in a way that works with sort of the NRCS soil health management planning system. The indicators that are part of that, aggregate stability, that's a key part of that. Soil organic matter, a way of measuring sort of the food source, active carbon, respiration, because all those microbes are breathing just like we are, and so you can measure the CO2 that comes off of those, and measuring protein, because, well, we all eat protein, and protein is actually where most of the nitrogen in the soil is stabilized. That's where it's not environmentally harmful. So if we have more protein in the soil, then more of it can potentially be made available through biological processes. So those are the indicators that are part of the soil health assessment with NRCS, plus all of the standard nutrient pH testing and that kind of thing. Now, how do we interpret those? That's still in the works, but we're a lot better off now than we were. NRCS can actually provide interpretations now. They're going to get built into a national database that's on its way. I think that's probably still a year or so off until it's like easily available in an interface where you plug in your value and you get an interpretation. But the basic idea is some soils are more able to, for example, accumulate organic matter than others. So in Georgia, where it's really hot and humid, if you get 2% organic matter, that's really good. Whereas in Iowa, that would be abysmal, right? And so the interpretations need to be adjusted for the soil type, the climate, so that we get something reasonable where we can say, yeah, you're low for where you are. For this soil type, if you have an aggregate stability of 50%, that's really good, or that's really low. You have potential to make it better or not, right? So those interpretations are starting to be available, and they can then be used to inform management. So for example, if you have low aggregate stability, in the short term, you might incorporate fresh organic materials, you might use shallow root cover crops, rotation crops, you might add manure, green manure, mulch. In the long term, if you can also reduce your tillage, that would sure be a really good thing. If you can, add surface mulches, if you can rotate with sod crops or with mycorrhizal hosts. We didn't quite get into that, but there are certain kinds of fungi that grow in the roots of organisms that are really good aggregators, right? So there's a lot we can do, and we can get into depth on that, but don't have time for that in this session. I just wanted to give you that as a basis for kind of the conservation planning approach that you're going to hear more about, because we want to really target management to address the constraints. And here's just one example. I worked with a producer in New Hampshire who had a very eutrophied pond, right? This is what the water looked like. This is what the grass looked like. I should have switched these two around, sorry about that. planted a really nice cover crop into the sod that was very compacted, alleviated some of the compaction. And what do you know, 2 years later, we got really nice clean water in that pond right at the bottom of that hill, right? So these are the kinds of outcomes that we can achieve. So kind of in a nutshell, right, we want to train folks on at least understanding basics, because I think when we understand basics, that allows us to change the paradigm. So health assessments can be used to inform how we plan to then take care of our soils, and then we implement that. And we have to always observe and adapt if something's not working, and goes right back into the process of doing some more assessment, doing some more learning, so that we can continue to adjust those plans and implement better. So with that said, I'm curious to hear from you all. Is this useful? Is this what you were hoping for? Are there resources that you would like to have more access to? What did you learn here that seems particularly relevant? Do you see yourself using this in your action plan? Are there some key aha messages that you can take out of this that would work for the folks that you work with? And I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that I can see the chat, because I think that will work better. And Beth, if you can see the chat.
So I have are there other types of, like, the YouTube videos? I know you've done others of examples of tests you can do in the field, like you showed yesterday, like besides for kind of that aggregates types of easy, you know, kitchen sink analysis. Are there other things that we could do out in the field?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of these indicators that I went through just now lend themselves to going out there with a producer and just kind of looking around, seeing, okay, hey, do you see crusting? What does that mean, right? And especially if you've just done one of the slake demos or the infiltration demos, so they get an idea of why aggregate stability matters so much. Then if you point out the crusting, or if you stick a shovel in the ground and you notice, oh, wow, look at that root. That's, you know, that's not growing nice and easily through crumbly chocolate cake structure. It's actually going, you know, this way and then that way and then that way. But something's a problem here, right? So the land PKS videos will give you a little bit of an idea of how to do those assessments, and you'll be able to incorporate those into some of the conversations. Lauren.
I think a lot of times I'll go out and the landowner will know there's a resource concern already, and they'll have like an idea, like, oh, I need more tiling, or like they already have something that they like want to do. And I know yesterday you said tiling's just a band-aid, and I think maybe if, like, my one thought is, like, maybe if we gave them the field soil health assessment, maybe they could like think about other ways they could address the concern. Yes,
absolutely. I think being able to do that assessment with the producer or the landowner who's got some ideas, being able to acknowledge, yes, you know, you do have this ponding issue, and yes, drain tile is often one way to get at it, but gosh, how's that water going to get to your drain tile, right? Because if your surface is crusted, if you don't have aggregates, if you don't have large pores in that surface, you're still going to get that ponding, and the water's just never going to make it to the drain tile, right? If you've presented, if you remember the infiltration demo that Doug Peterson did, where he had it rain on the just recently nicely loosely put in soil, right? If the water only makes it in an inch, it's not going to make it a foot down, 2 feet down to where that drain tile is, right? So being able to have that conversation in a respectful, acknowledging their concerns, acknowledging that those are important, asking them some questions, you know, where do you notice this happens? Gosh, let's take a look at your field. I'm noticing this crusting, so it might be hard for your water to even get all the way to your drain tile. Have you ever dug a hole out in the field right after it rains? How far does the water go down, right? One of the really insightful things you can do is, if it's been pretty dry and it finally rains, right? If you can make it out there at this time, or if you can ask the producer, hey, go out to your field right now, stick a shovel in the ground now that the rain's over. How far did the water make it in, right? Because a lot of the time, producers will do that and see, oh, wow, you know, I just barely wetted the surface and I've got ponding at the bottom of my hill, but actually the soil is still totally dry up here, right? And so those kinds of things can really start to help bring about the conversation if you can share a little bit about how soils work. Did that address your question a little bit?
Yeah, I think so.
Other questions, other thoughts, insights you're gaining, ways that you think you could make a difference in your area with this?
Bianca, I have a question. I'm just putting myself in these folks' shoes, you know, because this is like, I mean, it would be a lot of fun to go out and do an assessment. But if you're not a professional, like soil and water conservation district person or NRCS person, should I take one of them with me? You know, like, should I reach out to the, you know, so this helps me understand what a soil assessment is, but I don't know that I would know how to do one at this point. Is it okay to reach out to somebody at NRCS and say, this farmer would like a soil health assessment, I'd like to go with you, and then build on my knowledge?
Absolutely.
Will they do that with you?
Well, it depends on how much time they have, right? NRCS is often very, often what I hear is what the field office folks have time for is to write the contract. And, you know, so will they do that with you? Yes, absolutely, if they feel they have the time. And unfortunately, that's often the hardest part. Now, when I left, there was a lot of hiring of new folks going on. They managed to train all those new folks. Well, now there's, you know, hundreds, if not thousands, some more field office folks available in the country to do that kind of work, right? And the hope, the wish is that they are able to go to the field and that they know all this stuff. So that's certainly the goal. So yeah, if you can get an NRCS person to come along, or if you have somebody from a conservation district who knows the stuff a little better, or even if there's another producer who has had success and who enjoys talking with other producers and mentoring them, that's somebody you might bring along. If there's a soil health coalition in your state, if there's a group of folks that, you know, if your local industry folks have gone to some soil health workshops and do this kind of stuff, right? So we can, I think one of the things we need to kind of do is for each of you, who are the resources you might tap into might be one of your action steps on your plan, right? Figuring out who those people are who are passionate about soil health, who are a little more knowledgeable, and bringing them along. Or the other thing you can do is invite somebody to a meeting, right? If there's a soil health meeting going on in your area, if you can bring somebody along, you know, bring your producers along, bring your landowners along to that meeting so that you can learn together. That way you're sitting in the meeting with an expert who's training everybody on this. You all get a little bit of the same language. You all kind of ingest the same really cool information, and then you can have a conversation about it together. That's another way that we've been very effective in getting folks to change what they're doing.
Thank you. I will say this afternoon's state-specific sessions will get to a lot of what I just asked. So thank you. And just as kind of like looking at the time, I think we might have time for one more question, and then I want to be able to let everybody know what happens next.
Questions?
I'm looking if there's any in the chat. There seems to be some good statements.
I have a question.
Yes.
So it seems like all of these solutions to ponding and drainage issues are just Band-Aids. Really, the inherent problem at hand is this aggregate stability of the soil. So when these farmers are telling us about these plans that they have to implement drainage on their properties, how do we, I guess, know for sure that it's not just a Band-Aid? Like, how do we, I guess, have the confidence that in some circumstances drainage is like an appropriate solution? Like, is it just soil health can fix everything, or there's situations where they might actually like need to pursue this other opportunity?
That's a really excellent question. Let's see if I can tackle that in a kind of followable way. I think asking some questions would be the first thing I would do. Asking, is this something that's been a problem ever since you've had this farm, especially for somebody who's been at the farm for a long time? Or is this a recent thing that's happening more? If it's a farm that's been held for multiple generations, if somebody from an older generation is still there where you can get some insights, gosh, did your soils used to do this? Are they just doing it now? You know, did they used to look like this? You know, have you noticed changes in how your crops grow? Have you noticed changes in what the soil looks like after rain? Have you noticed changes in whether your bottom of the field tends to silt up, and maybe that didn't used to happen? To get an idea of whether there's visual signs of soil degradation. Going out there to do an infield assessment is a really good way to get some ideas, because if you see all these indicators of poor soil health, that seems like the first thing to take care of. And then if they still need drainage after that, that might be a good way to go at it. Also, take a look at, I don't know if you're familiar with soil survey. A really key piece to this is knowing what your soil type is, and soil types have ratings for whether they are somewhat poorly drained, whether they're somewhat well drained, moderately well drained, well drained, excessively drained. If you encounter a soil that is well drained or excessively drained, and your producer is talking about putting in drainage tile, you know that it's a soil health issue. If someone's got a poorly drained, or somewhere on that somewhat poorly drained kind of side, drainage tile might help manage for healthier soil, because it'll increase some of the flexibility, because when you drive on and work wet soil, you degrade it, because the soil becomes more vulnerable. It gets squished together, it becomes muddy, right? It gets sticky, and so you end up losing your large pores, and that makes it a lot harder to deal with it. Michelle.
So what happens if you have this conversation and the farmer, the producer, is in the areas that is probably the more marginal land, stuff that could be a CRP contract that you don't really want to encourage the production, and they want to get as much out of it as possible? Like, what are some good suggestions of having to encourage them to potentially, while work on the soil health, but not actively produce in those areas?
I think it's open for debate whether actively producing on those areas is a bad thing, because I think the reason that marginal lands tend to be the ones that we put in CRP is because CRP is, meets all the principles fairly well. Maybe sometimes not so much the diversity one, right? But like CRP is as close as we can get in terms of our current paradigm. But there are producers who have managed to very successfully produce food on slopes when they do it differently, right? So if you can get that soil to be not tilled and always have some kind of root in it, and you can still get some kind of product that can be sold off of it, great, So I don't know that it's necessarily you only want to not produce on it. I think you want to make sure it's totally covered. You want to make sure that there's no erosion. You want to make sure that the water goes in and that you do something about that. And it's very tricky to do that with marginal lands.